All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this next session, and thank you for joining us for this conversation all about creating and maintaining CVs. My name is Nadine Goldberg, and I work at the Life Design Lab as an assistant director. And I'm going to be not moderating this panel, but introducing our wonderful speaker and sharing some announcements later on. In just a moment, I'll introduce the speaker, but first, I want to make sure you know that we're leaving some time at the end of the session for questions. And we encourage you to go ahead and add those in the discussion area throughout the session. You don't need to wait till the end, so go ahead and add your questions as they come up, and we'll collect them and do a nice Q&A at the end of the session. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our instructor, our speaker for today, Dr. Smiti Nathan.
So I'm going to share my screen with everyone, but I'm also going to turn off my video just to hopefully get the Xfinity internet connection here to work a little better, and so I'm not sounding as garbled or the video audio isn't breaking up. But I assure you, I'm a real person and I'm not a robot, and I will appear again at the end of the presentation. So let me get this started first. Okay. Perfect. I'll turn off my video. Okay, excellent. Great. So in today's session, we're going to be discussing, how to create a CV. So real quickly, my name is Smiti Nathan. My PhD is in anthropology, specifically archaeology. I'm a life design educator, and I'm still an active researcher. So in today's workshop, you're going to get a lot of tips, some resources, and a lot of examples. And I wanted to shout out the wonderful space on Twitter. There were many scholars and people who offered their CVs as examples for this presentation. So I'll be shouting them out in the slides, and feel free to follow them on Twitter if you'd like. So really the goal of today's workshop is to equip you with tools and knowledge to create a CV that's a living document. And that will make a bit more sense later. And that can be adapted for various opportunities. So what is a CV? So a CV is a professional document chronicling your professional and academic history and experiences. It is short for the Latin curriculum vitae. Now, many of you might be here because you probably Googled how best to make a CV or what should I put in my CV, and you might have come across a lot of conflicting information or just wondering, what's the standard here? And the thing is, there aren't really universal set standards on creating a CV. Best practices really vary depending on your discipline, the type of job or opportunity you might be applied for, maybe the country you're based in, and even more. So there's a lot of factors that would impact what would make for a good CV. Now, one thing to get out of the way real quickly is you probably heard of a resume, and you might be wondering what the difference between a CV and a resume is. Now, a CV is typically a chronicled list of your academic history and professional history and experiences, whereas a resume is really a snapshot. So while a CV could be of unlimited page length, resumes are typically 1 to 2 pages. And CVs are often academic and research focused, while resumes are kind of the industry standard in terms of a job document. So, but the thing they both have in common is that you should definitely adapt it depending on the purpose. And I'll talk about that later. But I also want to note that these terms CV and resume might be used interchangeably depending on your field, the country you're working in, or even the discipline. I've even seen things called CV resumes before. And all this is to say it can get, a bit confusing. And so hopefully some of the suggestions and advice from today will help you navigate that. Now, I wanted to make a quick note to undergraduates applying to graduate school. So this session is really not going to focus on that, but I just wanted to mention that when you're applying as an undergrad to graduate school, some of those best practices for resumes, which honestly the Life Design Lab has a number of resources on. We offer daily drop-ins for resume reviews like Monday through Friday. You can take a lot of those best practices and apply them in your CV in terms of articulating your experiences. And this particular example from Ellen Butler, who's got into a PhD program and will be starting this fall, I thought this was a great example of how to separate out those experiences in a clear way. So what I often tell undergraduates applying to grad school is look at kind of like the best practices in terms of like a kind of almost quote unquote traditional academic CV in like your discipline or field, but also look at best practices in terms of resumes, because there's going to be certain experiences that you need to speak for. So what is a CV for? Maybe a bit more than you might think. So traditionally and most commonly, it's used to apply for opportunities. This could be grants, this could be graduate school, various jobs, and other opportunities that come along. And a CV is often requested. So it's important to adapt your CV according to the application instructions and norms of the opportunity. So for example, while I mentioned a CV could be of unlimited page length, some grants and some jobs specifically request that you send in a 2 or 3 page CV. And there are ways to deal with that in terms of your headings, which we'll talk about a bit later. CVs are often and increasingly used more for sharing, especially for scholars who are trying to raise their digital presence or like brand. I've seen a lot of CVs shared online or on a website or other digital mediums, and I'll be providing some examples of that shortly too. And the CV that you might post here would be to give broader audiences an idea of your work in general. So this document that you might like post publicly might not be as tailored as one for opportunities. And then you can create a CV that's a personal record. And, a lot of scholars are also increasingly doing this. And this personal version of the CV is great to keep track of what you've accomplished for yourself. And it's really helpful when you're applying for future opportunities. I'll mention this a bit later, but when you keep a personal record for yourself, like you don't have to worry so much like, oh, okay, should I include this experience or should I include that experience? You can include everything and articulate it. And I also encourage this practice for resumes. And this is just a great way to draw in like your holistic experiences, all the things that you've done, and then have that record for yourself. So when it comes to applying for jobs or opportunities down the line, you have like a very robust document to pull from. So one thing I had mentioned before was having different versions of your CV. And I wanted to give this example that a researcher sent me. And Dr. Gaub keeps 2 versions of her CV. Dr. Gaub has a public version of her CV that doesn't include submitted publications or publications in progress. And it only shows funded grants. So this is not to say that is the practice you should follow, but I think what's important here is that Dr. Gaub defines for herself what goes into a public CV for them and also a full CV for them. And so the full CV, this is something they use for, annual reviews, and this is something they keep everything in. So kind of that personal document that I had mentioned before. Now, I also mentioned something about different opportunities. And one topic that came up for discussion was even if you're applying to all academic jobs, applying to a teaching institution or a predominantly teaching institution or a research institution of varying degrees, you would want to adapt your resume for that. And Kate Bradford, who's the director of PDCO on our medical campus, they have a great resource that outlines different types types of CVs for different types of academic appointments. So I encourage you to check that out, because you don't have time to go into the intricacies of that today, especially since this workshop is focused on just getting started. But this is a great resource to look at. And then I also wanted to mention that a lot of people are, posting their CVs on websites, and this speaks to kind of that public record that's sharing your work broadly. And some things to keep in mind here. There's a lot of platforms in which you could choose. Some people opt to do WordPress or, a personal website, as we see with Ellen's example here. And a great thing about her example, as we see here, she does have her CV in kind of a HTML format, so a web format, but she also offers the option to download the full CV as a PDF, which can be quite helpful. Often in CVs, we say that, like, hey, you want to keep the, formatting pretty, clean and like basic and easily updatable. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So something like tables probably aren't like the best idea for like a word processor, but it could be really clean on a website, as we see with Guaro's example here. And then finally, for, my coders, my computer scientists, like my builders out there, GitHub is a popular place where, people share their CV, as we see with Dr. Garrison here. So these are examples of, if you choose to share your work a bit broadly, websites are a great option for that. So as I also mentioned before, in terms of that personal record, CVs, if you keep a personal CV, it could be a great way to keep track of what you accomplished. And this can vary in degree in terms of like how succinct or robust you want to be. And again, like if you want to adapt your CV to whatever opportunity you're applying for, but you want to give yourself like a robust data set to pull from. So we see some examples of here from people who have really spent some time articulating their experiences and accomplishments. And so they might not use this particular version in a job application. They might, but at least they have like a robust data set to pull from. Now, you want to definitely like talk to different people in your field again, and that's something I'm going to be encouraging throughout, to see what the best practices are for that. But I think for your personal record, having some details is really helpful, because it's just super easy to forget like all the things you did and accomplished. So in terms of like kind of how, or almost like what platform to use in constructing your CV, that's really up to you. You want to have some type of like word processing platform, but the key here is you want to use a platform that you're comfortable constantly updating. So for some people, that's LaTeX, like Dr. Garrison here. For me, I'm kind of basic, and I just Word works for me. But then also we have people who like to use Google Docs, and that enables also that sharing element, like Dr. Sparks here. So again, just pick something that you feel comfortable constantly updating in. Now, in terms of formatting basics, again, like this can be a bit dependent on a lot of factors, but in general, I advocate for a readable font. So this can be both serif and sans serif fonts. This could be Arial, Open Sans, Times New Roman. I really highly advise like not doing any type of cursive scripts or anything that would be really hard to read. And you want to have at least a minimum of a 10-point font. Like mine is 11, but it also just depends on the font you're using. If certain fonts, even if they are like 10 or 11, like are hard to read. So that's something you want to, play around with a little bit, and then of course ask some feedback on. The content, so not the header, so excluding this area, I really advocate for it to be left justified. It does make things easier to read. And you also want to include dates for everything. And I know this excerpt of my CV doesn't like show that as well for like the section headings, but like, since a CV is truly a chronicled like list of like your accomplishments, you want dates to that to track that. And then also, like, since you don't have to try to squeeze everything on one page, you don't have to be super narrow with your margins. And then I do want to give a shout out to one resource that was really instrumental when I first started crafting my CV, and that's Dr. Karen Kelsky from The Professor Is In. They have like a pretty detailed blog post on her rules for the academic CV. And this is really for the US market. And, I think there's some great advice in there, but there's also some things, depending on the purpose of what your CV is for, take any advice, honestly, with a grain of salt. So if you want like more tips on formatting, I definitely recommend checking out that post. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the chat. So I think Nadine, before in introducing me, had mentioned like there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers after this presentation, but feel free to start populating the chat already with any questions you might have. So there are really two main parts to a CV. There's the main header, which you include your name, any orienting details that you'd like. And then the rest of it is truly like sections with like section headings that are relevant to your discipline and audience or for yourself. So in terms of other examples of main headers, like obvious example here, you can tell he's pursuing quite a technical field, like in computer science. So having his GitHub front and center, even in his CV, is like quite important and important to that field. So that's totally fine to put up there. Anytime with links or hyperlinks, you can definitely hyperlink to documents like Tyler is doing here, but it's also sometimes useful to kind of spell out the URL in case like the document is printed. So this is, of course, like being very cognizant of your audience. Now, both individuals here like had their document on a web-based browser or like into a clickable PDF. So having those elements there hyperlinked was fine in that setting. But if they were to convert it to a PDF that might be like printed out, they might want to adjust certain things accordingly. But these are just some examples of how headers can look. Again, like Tyler has his kind of centered, which is totally fine. And Avi's there's like more left justified. Now, section headers are key. They help organize key information. And there's a lot of ways in which you could take your section headers. And these are common ones for those starting out, especially in creating a CV to include. So that's your educational history, publications, and we're going to go into this a bit more. Grants, this can be awards, fellowships, grants. Some disciplines see a distinction between those terms. Others lump them all together. So again, you want to ask people in your field and do some work investigating to see what the best practices are. Conference activity is quite common, especially this includes presentations, posters, organized sessions. So that means sessions you've organized. That can all go under conference activity. And I think with conference activity, that shows like you can also have subheadings. I mean, you don't want to go crazy with having like, too many embedded subheadings, but having something like conference activity and then subheadings around like presentations, posters, organized sessions, that's completely fine. And then teaching activity is also a common thing to put on a CV. Now, and I do want to reiterate, these are not the only headings, but these are good headings to start off with to get you started. So in terms of publications, different fields have different standards. In my field in particular, which is anthropology with a focus on archaeology, people reviewing my resume, especially for opportunities, they want to know which publications are peer-reviewed and which aren't. And they want to know what are journal articles, what are book chapters, what are other things. So making sure to separate out like my peer-reviewed publications under my publication section is crucial here. We see with Jess's CV here a distinction between submitted manuscripts and manuscripts in prep. I think this is also important in terms of clarity. As you're building out your publication pages, publications are in varying stages. So your only doing yourself a service and the people who are reading your CV, especially if it's being evaluated for an opportunity, to be very forthright about the stage that a certain publication is in. So if it has been published, great, then you want to focus on kind of different categories. But if it hasn't been published, but it has been submitted, you want to indicate that. And then some people choose to include a section about manuscripts in prep. Now, in prep is a very vague term. It could be like, I have this in my mind that I want to write about. And that could be great, especially if there's an idea that you are ready to write about and you want to articulate that to anyone who's evaluating your work. But then you don't want to go too crazy in that aspect too. Other manuscripts in prep could be like, we're about to submit and I want to like communicate that this work is going to be out there in some shape or form. People have varying opinions on including especially manuscripts and prep. So that's a conversation I definitely encourage you to have with people in your discipline and other scholars, and then figure out a mechanism for yourself that you're comfortable with and kind of some bounding guidelines for yourself there. And then, in other disciplines, there are certain categories that might be a little fuzzy. So for example, technical reports, like if you do more like technical work, or if, for example, I do field work, like we often have to submit technical reports, and those are, a bulk of some of the publications that I personally have. And it's important to include that to show that that's there, but that might not be pertinent to every field. And in some of the science, submitting your publication to kind of like an archive as a preprint is also common practice. So to include that could also be helpful. So the other thing you want to think of when you're creating different sections is like, there's not really hard and fast rules, but you want to also think about like various values. And what I mean by that is like, what does your field value? What does your discipline value? What does the opportunity you're applying for value? What information do they want? And make that information as accessible and as easy as possible. So the first example with Tomas, I believe he's from the Czech Republic, and these sort of metrics are important in landing opportunities there. So including the H index or the times you've been cited without like self-citation, those are metrics that are important. Now, perhaps that's something we might not include for other countries, but he recognizes that's important for the opportunities that he's applying to. Now, there might be certain categories, depending on your field, that are important to indicate that wouldn't really translate to other fields. So we see here with Dr. Daniel Bradford, in his discipline, it's important to articulate experience providing clinical supervision. So there's a whole section that clearly outlines that with the dates. And that's actually like really nice formatting in terms of like having your dates and then experiences. And then, you want to also maybe think a bit about like personal values and things that you contribute that could either be in a public document, a personal document, or things you're applying for too. So here we see Dr. Ashley Thomas with a whole section on like media interviews and coverage. And a quick note, I typically don't recommend like a lot of or any other color in your CV besides like black font, but I think Dr. Ashley Thomas's did a really nice job of like selectively using like color for her headings, and like in looking at her whole CV, it definitely works. So in terms of formatting, well, I definitely recommend keeping just to one color. There are ways you could incorporate a little bit of color in that would work, and for the audiences maybe you're creating your CV for. So back to her content, like we see that doing media work seems to be a value, maybe to her field, but definitely to her. So including a section on that and outlining that is important. So now when it comes to personal values, I will say that I definitely recommend keeping track of those accomplishments and experiences in a personal version you might have for your CV. And then in terms of a public version or a version for an opportunity, that's something you definitely want to do a bit more research on and make a decision that is based on talking to people in your field or who might be applying or have got the opportunity you're applying for. So then we also have a skills section, which you also see in resumes. This is, I would say, fairly optional, but depending on the field could be quite useful. And for Dr. Jacob Rhodes' example here, I think this is a good thing. You see this kind of page separation here, and that is totally fine. The only time, like a CV is this kind of living document, that's this list, and like it's not always going to get cut perfectly in terms of like when the next page starts. So having something like this, to me personally, is totally fine. Now, I wouldn't recommend having a heading at the end of the page, like technical skills, and then everything on the other page. But, when it comes to your other sections, like it's not going to neatly fit on one page, and that's totally okay. So you can articulate various different skills depending on what's important to your field or what you want to communicate. So here we see a lot of like technical skills surrounding various softwares, programming language, even like statistical analyses here. And when we look at Dr. Gaub's example, we see certain certifications listed, coding, and languages, especially for like the humanities and social science field. Like that can be really important to indicate, and not just listing the language, but your skill level in the language. And this is Dr. Gaub does something here about like very select software. I think when you're trying to condense your CV for certain opportunities to 1 to 2 or even 3 pages, a common thing to do with your headings is to use the word select. So instead of saying publications, it might be select publications. This also triggers to the reader that like you've curated a list and that there's more to it than they're seeing. So there might be some experiences that you're just not sure where to, put, or if you should put them. And, there is probably mixed messages and, split opinions in your discipline. I say definitely still keep track of them in your personal version of your CV, but then make strategic decisions on like when to include them in different arenas. So we have often public engagement and science communication like falls under that umbrella. But I'm seeing overall like increasingly that like these types of media coverage, science communication, like public outreach, that's becoming increasingly listed in like many CVs. So we're about to end the kind of didactic portion of today's workshop where I'm lecturing, and we're going to move into Q&A. So I really please encourage you to add any questions you have to the chat. And so my goal here today was to give you some tips to get started, to offer some resources that I have found useful that you should definitely check out, and a wide variety of examples from different disciplines from people all across the world. So thank you to the Twitterverse for that. And again, I really hope to equip you with some foundational tools and knowledge to start creating a CV or a number of CVs that's a living document that can be adapted for various opportunities. So some of the key takeaways from today's workshop that I hope you'll take with you. The first is to ask, crafting a CV doesn't have to be a lonely process. You can talk to people, or if you don't want to first talk to people, you can do your own research online, and there are a wide variety of examples. You can even ask on like your social media platforms. Like I have to say, like the tweet that I sent out, like asking for CV examples was probably my most popular tweet ever, and like people were so generous in terms of like offering their CV for today's workshop, but also is a great point of discussion in terms of people asking questions and just getting a broad view of CV practices throughout the world. And especially if you're applying for a certain opportunity, definitely talk to people who might have experience supporting candidates for those opportunities, or who've landed those opportunities themselves, or in some way connected to those opportunities, for example, like an admissions officer. The other thing is that I hope you add, like, this document should be a living document. That means you should be adding to it consistently. And that's not to add any pressure or like stroke any imposter fears on like, oh, I didn't add to my CV this week, like I'm behind. No, it's more to say that this is not a one and done document. You want to make sure that you have a platform that you feel comfortable adding things to, that like you're cognizant of where your experience where it fits in terms of like your professional development. So this is definitely like an additive document. And then finally, I hope you take away that like your CV is not a static piece. In addition to adding to it, you want to adapt it for various settings and for various reasons. And I think it's good to get in the habit of creating different versions of your CV. And I think that personal version can be quite powerful because it gives you the freedom to track accomplishments that maybe you feel like your field like might not value, but are important to you. And this can be really powerful, especially when it comes time to translate your experiences for different opportunities, like once you graduate. So I know we're going to talk about this in another session, but you don't have to just go into an academic role with your graduate degree. Like your graduate degree can enable you to do a lot of different things. And kind of the traditional academic CV can be a bit restrictive in terms of like how success or accomplishments are measured. So getting into the habit of creating that personal version of a CV for yourself where everything you've done is listed in there. There's even probably details in there that you might not include in a public CV or a CV that you might submit for an opportunity. It's also a great kind of personal reminder of like the various facets of you and what you bring to the table, and like what you could bring across a wide variety of opportunities. So I hope those are some 3 takeaways to get you started with your CV. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and Nadine and I will turn on our video and head into Q&A.
Great.
Hello.
Well, thanks so
I'm
much.
not a robot.
Thanks for that wonderful presentation, Smiti. That was such a good start to the conversation. I see one question in the discussion area so far, so all of our viewers, please continue to populate that space. But the question here for you, Smiti, is do you ever include volunteer work in a CV?
Yes. So volunteer can mean a variety of different things. I think for sure, standard practice could be professional service. So we're thinking of volunteer opportunities directly in your field. So that could be, sometimes I include public outreach in there. Sometimes that's reviewing different journals. So yes, if you have limited space in your CV because you're applying for a specific opportunity, and let's say there's like a 3-page CV, you might want to think how much of that to include, if at all. But if it's for an opportunity where service is important, then you definitely want to have that section. But I think this is a good example of using your section headers wisely to communicate clarity. So maybe having a section that says professional service, and then you can have other section headings that maybe communicate different types of service. So there is a bit of stylistic creativity, but I will say, to summarize, like professional service is quite common, and then other service opportunities, definitely keep that in your personal CV, and then pick and choose when you want to communicate that on like a public CV or for an opportunity.
That's great. Thanks, Smiti. I do not see any other questions in the discussion yet. We'll maybe give it another minute in case anyone wants to drop one in there.
So one thing I wanted to quickly touch on that came on the compelling personal statements workshop by Dr. Robert Tinkle, which was great. We had a question on how do I communicate gaps? Like maybe gaps in my resume or gaps in my experiences. I will say, and this is a bit more common in Europe that I've seen, that especially if you've taken something like parental leave, or if you've taken like a gap or a bridge year, or if you've gone to industry and you're coming back to academia, there are ways to use your section headings to communicate that, but typically those are outlined by the organization that's accepting an application. So I would say, like, if you feel like you have a gap, first talk to people in like your field to see like if the gap is as big as you see. Sometimes it can be important to articulate. For example, a concrete example, in certain fields, you're only eligible for opportunities if you're so many years out of your PhD. So for example, if you finish your PhD, you can only apply for certain postdoctoral opportunities or certain fellowships if you're 1 to 5 years out from your PhD. If you're beyond 5 years out, you're not eligible. Now, the caveat with this is maybe you've had to take parental leave, maybe you've had to take health leave, or maybe you're in a category, maybe you have a gap experience that's not those things but qualify as like time that doesn't work against you. It might be worth then having a section on like what that time was used for, but typically that's a great question to ask like an admissions officer or, you know, someone who has experience with the opportunity you're applying for.
That's great. Something that I would love to get your take on, Smiti, is a little bit more discussion, if we could, around for current undergraduate students or very recent graduates, you know, things they might consider, how their CV might look different from some of the ones that they find online, some of the examples they see, and like what sorts of things they should be thinking about.
Absolutely. The first thing I would tell any undergraduate or recent graduate who is applying to graduate school, like, don't freak out. Like, you're probably seeing CVs of people who have spent a long time in graduate school or who are quite established in their profession. I don't think, and the concurrent session probably could answer this a bit better. That's that type of CV. That's not the expectation that we have when we're evaluating like undergraduate CVs for like graduate admission, or even like opportunities for grants that are directed to undergraduates or recent graduates. I think where those examples are useful is to get an idea of what's important and valuable in your discipline. So again, like really analyze those like section headings and see, okay, like what are the common patterns in terms of what people are communicating? Yes, publications for sure, conference presentations, but there might be a way in terms of how your field talks about teaching experience. That's good to know. Or service, for example, that's also good to know. Maybe clinical experience, like seeing those kind of patterns are quite useful to get started. And then also to remember your CV as an undergraduate applying is most likely going to be a bit of a hybrid from the best practices of a resume. So really articulating those work experiences, whether it's like research experience, teaching experience, or other experiences that, you know, I put in a kind of my day jobs like during undergrad on my CV when I applied to graduate school, and even like my corporate position too, because one, I wanted to show like I was doing something with my time, and I didn't view it as a gap. I just viewed like this is what I was doing, and I was, you know, learning skills there that were sometimes mostly indirectly relevant, but it still contributed to like my growth as like a scholar. And then really tightening those accomplishment statements, which the Life Design Lab can definitely help with. We have a lot of resources for that, but, you know, kind of spelling out a bit what you did more in like a resume format for those experiences. I think that's a totally fine practice to do as like an undergraduate.
That's great. Thank you, Smitty. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So maybe to wrap up, we could address, other resources or places students might want to look if they would like to continue the conversation here.
Absolutely. So a recording of this presentation will definitely be made available not immediately after the boot camp, but like shortly after. So you can always come back and reference this. I will be doing a public lecture in the next couple of weeks about CVs, very similar to this presentation. So if you have any questions that come up, feel free to email me. If Nadine could put my email in the chat, that would be awesome. smiti.nathan@jhu.edu. But then also I would really peruse online. I mentioned the Professor is In as a really strong resource to start thinking about formatting. Our JHU's PDCO in terms of like comparing various CVs for different types of academic applications. And then honestly, the biggest thing you can do is, in addition to Googling, like start reaching out to people. Academia and ResearchGate, GitHub, those often are places where people post their CVs. So that's a great place to look. And then Dr. Kate Bradford also mentioned that in some disciplines, like CVs are part of dissertations. So as a Hopkins student, you can access various dissertations and you can see if like people have included their CV in their dissertation and like how that looks. Definitely recommend doing that for your field because that could get a little unwieldy if you do everything. But I don't think there's an issue also in asking for help with a variety of people. And we definitely encourage it as part of the life design model.
Terrific, Smiti. Thank you. I just dropped a few of the resources. I tried to keep up with it. Dropped a few of them in the chat. So they're here now. And I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Kate Bradford because that's a great transition into our next session. So for those of you who are going to stay on, our next session today is going to run from 3 to 3:50. So you've got a bit of a break here if you need it. And it is all about professional development during graduate school, which is such an important topic. What you can and should be doing while you're in graduate school to prepare for what's next for you. And we've got a great rundown of panelists, different experts from around the university, including Dr. Kate Bradford. So I hope you'll join us there. And if that's not for you, we'll be resuming tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. again. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Smiti for a wonderful presentation. And we'll see you again soon.
Bye, everyone. I see the